down in the Solly garden, my love and I meet. She passed the Solly garden on two snow white feet. She bid me take life easy as the flowers grow on the trees. But I was young and foolish, with her did not agree. Down in my Solly's garden, above an ivy bush, each evening and each morning, there sings a sweet song thrush. His notes come ringing clearly, tidings to me tell. And oh, I know already my Sally loves me well, for I've kissed her lily white features some silvery eve of May, and she whispered, shall we wander to the break of day? We wandered through her garden, and the flowers were wet with dew, and I saw the love light beaming in her fond eyes of blue. Down in my Solly's garden, when snowy hawthorns blow, my heart it grew love weary when I at last must go. The bloom was on the hawthorn the night I bade farewell, and I left my Solly weeping down in an ivy dell, in a field down by the river. My love and I stand, and on my leaning shoulder she placed a snow white hand. She bade me take life easy as the grass grows on the weirs. I was young and foolish, now I'm full of tears. Yes, I was young and foolish, now I'm full of tears.
Hi there, that's Stephen O'Hara here, and I'm telling a story in St Patrick's Cemetery in Craigagh in Cushendun for the Glens of Antrim Storytelling Festival. And the story I'm going to tell right now is the story of the Fuldiew Stone. Now, take yourself back to 1803. At that time, there was a headstone here in the cemetery, and we know that the headstone has been lying flat on the ground since that time, for reasons that will become clear as I continue. Now, inscribed on the headstone in 1803, the only words were the burying place of Charles McAllister. And it was the McAllister family plot, but Charles was the only name on the stone. And Charles had a son whose name was John. John was 18 years old, and he was a sailor. And he was betrothed to be married. And he and his fiancée had agreed that he would take one more voyage, and that while he was gone, she would make the wedding preparations. And on his return, they would have the wedding. And he set sail from Cushendun Bay. His schooner lay in the bay, and he was rowed out to the boat, and off they sailed. Now, his fiancée, whose name we never have discovered, had a sister who lived in Glenravel, and her sister was a seamstress, and it was her plan to go to stay with her sister for a few days, and that together they would make her wedding gown. And as the ship sailed from Cushendun, she set off on a donkey from Cushendun to Glenravel, Now, as you can imagine, in 1803, the infrastructure was not good and the roads were not good. And a journey of that distance across a mountain road was quite an undertaking. And it was going to take her the best part of a day, or maybe a whole day and part of an evening. And away she went. Now, after just about 3 days at sea, the people of the village gathered round the harbour because they saw a familiar schooner heading round the headland at Fairhead, and they knew that something was wrong because the ship was back much too soon. It was destined to be away for several weeks, and it was returning after only 3 days. And more people gathered, and a silence passed through the crowd as they gathered on the harbour because they knew that there was a tragedy. And sure enough, the ship dropped anchor and they lowered a boat, and then into the boat they lowered on 2 ropes a body wrapped in a white sheet. And then 2 men got into the boat and they rowed to shore. And when they pulled into the harbour, they broke the news to the people that it was the body of young John McAllister. And they'd only been a day out at sea when he had gone aloft to the tallest mast of the ship. And the ship had lurched into a wave and he had fallen from the mast onto the deck of the ship and he died. So they ended the voyage there and then, and they brought him home for burial. Now they were in a dilemma, the family, the people, because the fiancé was away in Glenarm, a difficult journey from Cushendun. So they could hold the body for several days and send word and bring the girl home, or they could wake him and bury him and wait for her to return to break the news to her when she came home. Nobody really wanted to take such terrible, sad news to her anyway. So they decided that's what they would do, and they waked him and they buried him. And beneath his father's name, they inscribed on the stone, and his son John, aged 18, died 1803. Now, after a few days, the people saw the fiancée arriving back into Cushendun on the donkey. Her satchel was bulging from the beautiful gown that she and her sister had made, and she arrived into the village and people dropped their heads and their shoulders fell and people avoided her, and she knew something was wrong. And when she got to her house, they broke the news to her that John had died. Well, she went into such a terrible depression. That evening, she couldn't even be spoken to. She wandered aimlessly round the house, and in fact, in the afternoon, she just wandered off out of the house. The people thought, she's grieving, we need to give her time, and they let her go. They didn't try to stop her. But as the evening wore on and darkness fell, people began to get worried. And her family started searching around the farm buildings, started searching down lanes and loanings that were nearby, but there was no sign of her. And they raised a search party. And they searched through the whole village, and they searched by lamplight through the night. And at morning's light, they arrived here at the cemetery. And they made their way all the way down through the graves to this spot where I'm standing. And here was the stone. And on the top of the stone was lying John McAllister's fiancée. And she had expired. She had passed away in the night. They say she died of a broken heart. When they rolled her body from the stone, they found a stone in her hand, and she had carved during the night a further inscription on the stone. And it's one of the most beautiful pieces of love poetry that you'll ever hear. She had written on the stone, the soft sandstone, "Your ship, love, is moored, head and stern for a full due." Now, full due was a very common term for sailors. If you were a sailor, you visited 10 ports. You didn't get paid by the captain in all 10 ports. You waited until you'd made your voyage all the way to your home port, and then you were paid off according to your rank and your service, and the sailors called this receiving their full due. So it was 2 words, but the way that she wrote it, it was written as 1 word, because that's how the people said it, your full due. And it just means you have what's coming to you, you have what you've earned. So the lines, I'll say it again, "Your ship, love, is moored, head and stern for a full due." And of course she meant much more than just being a sailor. Now, we never found out the girl's name, but the heritage group locally, they commissioned a sculpted seat in Cushendun Harbour, and on it they have carved an impression of the girl, and it's known as the Fuldiew seat, and it's in the harbour overlooking the very spot where John embarked and where John was brought home when he had died. So that's the love story of the Fuldiew Stone.
Deep in the heart of the forest, there stood an old, old tree. This tree had been here since before, growing, dreaming, listening, being. This tree had heard the rhythm of the earth herself as she rocked her seeds deep in the earth. This tree had heard the whisper of the breeze as the shoot breaks into the light in spring. This tree knew the murmur of the breeze through its leaves and the gentle whoosh of autumn leaves falling. And this tree, it knew the patter of little squirrels climbing up its trunk, the buzzing of eager bees, the swish of passing birds' wings. And all these things the tree kept as memories deep in its core. And sometimes, when the time was right, the tree would echo out these sounds for the forest to hear. It would play its music, and when it did this, all the other trees would stay still. Even the air would hang still to listen. One day, as the tree was playing its music for the forest all around, an old man passed by, and he heard the music of this tree. And this old man thought he had never heard anything so beautiful in his whole life. And so that he could remember the tree, he reached up and he wove some of the branches together to make a living harp. And then he went home to his village, but on the way he met the king of that land, and he couldn't stop himself from sharing the secret of this tree, and so he told the king about this special tree that played beautiful music. Well, the king loved music, and he had a court full of musicians, and so he insisted that the next day the old man took him back to this tree in the forest for the tree to play for them. And they came back, and they all gathered around the king and the musicians and the old man, and there in the forest they waited and waited and waited. But the tree was silent. Finally, the king grew impatient and said, "This tree cannot play by itself. Come, musicians, see if you can make it play." And one by one, each musician stepped forward and they raised their hands to the branches, but they could not make even the softest of sounds or the most meaningless of murmurs. The tree was silent, until finally the king said, "Cut down the tree. Maybe it is more use dead than alive." And the old man, ashamed at having shared its secret, said, "Please, your majesty, I am no great musician, but let me have one try. If I can make the tree play, will you let it live?" "Very well," said the king. And the old man stepped forward to the tree. But he whispered something to the tree before he began. And then he raised his hands to the branches, and at once the tree trembled into life all along its trunk, and the leaves began to vibrate and fly free with laughter, and music arose from the tree, sweet sounds that swayed and swelled, swelling and swaying like a sea of trees, and the music played out in the forest. And all the musicians and the king and the other trees bowed their heads to listen. And as the sweet music played, after a while it changed into a mournfulness and a moaning, and the tree began to sing songs of sorrow, and sap began to run down its trunk like blood, and all the listeners bowed their heads. The music played on until it was played out, and then the old man brought his hands down from the tree, and the tree was still. And the king spoke. "Tell me, old man, you whispered something to the tree before you began. What did you say?" And the old man said, "Your Majesty, I cannot command or demand music, and I am no great musician. But you must have said something." "Yes," said the old man. "I simply asked the tree to play, not what we wanted to hear, but whatever it wanted to say." And so the tree lived. And I would invite you, if you live near a forest, to go into the forest and listen to the music of the trees as we enter this beautiful, gentle autumn.
Oh, my name is Bob Casey, I'm a forester to my trade. From Portland on to Garva, I know every woodland glade. My long years of work, I've planted more trees than I've felled. And that's the very reason for the strange tale I shall tell. Fall-a-dee, if you want to leave your mark on earth, plant a sturdy tree. One fine winter's morning, I was seated at my desk, calculating acreage of woods around Glenchesque. There came a knocking to my door, and when I looked around, I spied a little man there, not 6 inches from the ground. Fall-a-dee, if you want to leave your mark on earth, plant a sturdy tree. Well, I knew at once before me stood one of the fairy folk, but to call upon a mortal man, it surely was no joke. But his clothes were rags, his eyes were filled with tears which caused his chin. So pitiful a sight was he, I could not but ask him in. Fall-a-dee, if you want to leave your mark on earth, plant a sturdy tree. Well, he sat down upon the matchbox, and he started to describe how he'd once been held in high esteem by members of his tribe. He provided homes and property for sale, for lease or let, and these homes they were the fairy trees, and this caused me to regret. Fall-a-dee, if you want to leave your mark on earth, plant a sturdy tree. For at that moment I recall those trees I'd had cut down, the oak, the ash, the thorn, the birch, the willow and the rowan. These must have been the dwelling place of all his kith and kin, the fairy sprites, the wood elves who did reside therein. Fall-a-dee, if you want to leave your mark on earth, plant a sturdy tree. Oh no, this little man said, sir, it was not your sharp axe that caused me such insolvency, my creditors to vex. Planting all those saplings led me so low of late, for you've driven down the market price of fairy real estate. Fuldiew. If you want to leave your mark on earth, plant a sturdy tree, Fuldiew. Fuldiew. If you want to leave your mark on earth, plant a sturdy tree.
Hi, it's Stephen O'Hara here, and just now we're at the Glendun River, just below Glendun Viaduct. And the story that I'm going to tell you is the story of the fairies and the Brown River. Now, long ago, when Ireland was young, and the country was populated by giants and the little people and the people of the She, there was a young girl who lived near here with her mother. She was a good girl. She always helped round the farm with the chores, and she went every day to the river to collect drinking water for the family, because the river was so clear and so clean that it was the best drinking water in Ireland. And she never rushed to the river. When she went with her pail, she dilly-dallied. She was a dreamer. Her eye would be caught by a cloud that looked like a bull, or she'd see a field of wildflowers on the far side of the river, or she'd hear a deer skittering about in the undergrowth, and she'd stop to see if she could catch a glimpse of it. So this day, when she arrived at the river, she was 10 or so yards back from the river, and she heard a strange sound. And she hid in behind a tree, and she peered round, and at the water's edge there was a tiny little old woman, down on her knees, working her hands back and forth on a washboard. And she was singing as she worked. And she sang, "He's my hero, my dashing darling. He's my hero, my own true love. I've known no rest but only sorrow since he went far away." She was intrigued, and she looked at the old woman, and she noticed that there were a lot of creases round her mouth, and she knew that she was an old lady that liked to laugh. But there was an equal number of creases round her eyes, and she realised that the little old woman had also experienced tears very often. Her long grey hair was loose and hung round her shoulders, and it reflected the light from the sun that poked through the trees. And she continued washing and scrubbing and washing and scrubbing. And the young girl looked at what she was washing, and she noticed the tiniest little white shirt. Oh, no bigger than the distance between your finger and your thumb. And she scrubbed them and washed them, and then slapped them on a rock and set them to the side. Next came a pile of tiny little trousers. Oh, trousers no bigger than the length of your hand. And she started again with the same rhythm back and forth, and singing, "He's my hero, my dashing darling. He's my hero, my own true love. I've known no rest but only sorrow since he went far away." And at this the young girl got the courage to go forward and speak to her. Up until then, she had been afraid to disturb her, because there were lots of stories about the people of the She, and they were everywhere in Ireland at that time, and if you disturbed them or crossed them, they could bring down a terrible curse on you. But she felt emboldened to go forward, and she went up and she said, "Excuse me." And the old woman smiled and looked up, and she said, "Yes, dear." And she said, "Could you tell me, what are these tiny little clothes that you're washing at the river?" And she said, "Oh, these are the war clothes of the Irish fairies. And there's to be a great battle tomorrow between the fairies of Ireland and the fairies of Scotland. And when we send our boys out into battle, we like them to look really good. So I'm washing all their clothes today." And the young girl said, "Oh, that's terrible. How will I know who has won the battle?" And the old lady said, "If you come back here tomorrow to this very spot at this very time and look at the river, if the river flows clean and clear, you'll know that the Irish fairies won. But if the river flows brown, you'll know that the blood from their war shirts has stained the river forever." And the young girl thanked her, and as she walked away, the old lady brought out a pile of white stockings, Oh, tiny wee things, no bigger than your finger. And she scrubbed and carried on, and she sang. Now the young girl went home, but devil the wink of sleep did she get that night, because all she had in her head was little old women and fairies and tiny little fairy clothes and the battle that would come the next day. When she rose in the morning, she went about her chores, but when she was lifting in the eggs from the hens, all she could think of, how's the battle going? And as she milked the cow, she wondered, will I ever see the fairies again? And the day wore on slowly enough, but evening time came, and she said to her mother, I'm just taking the pail here to go back to the river for some water. And she did, but today she didn't dilly-dally. She went as fast as her legs would carry her. And as she approached the river bank, she was almost afraid to get there for what she would find. So she closed her eyes, and she walked forward with her eyes closed right to the river bank until she heard the water rushing past. And then she took a deep sigh, and she opened her eyes, and she looked, and her heart sank to her boots, because the river was as brown as peat. And she turned her head up the glen, and she turned her head down towards the sea, but it was the same through its entire length. The river was as brown as the turf that was in their shed at home. And she filled her water from the river, and she walked back home, and she told her mother everything that she'd experienced. And her mother said, aye, right enough, I've heard of such things happening. Do you know, maybe that river should be called the River Dun, because in Irish, of course, the word dun means brown. And from that day till this, the river has been called the River Dun. And the glen through which it flows took its name from it, and it is called Glendun, where we're standing now. And as the river reaches the sea, the people built a village, and the village there is called Cushendun, which means the place beside the brown river. Now, lots of fairies lost their lives that day, and that might explain why fairy sightings are so rare these days. People haven't seen fairies in Glendun very often, but they're still here.
My name's Colin Urwin from Glenarm in the Glens of Antrim, and I'm up at the top end of the glens on Fairhead, and I'm looking out over Rathlin Sound to Rathlin Island beyond. And I'm going to tell you a story about a farmer from Rathlin, a man by the name of John McIntyre. When John came of age, 21, he inherited the family farm. His father always used to say 1 cow would thrive on it, 2 would survive, but 3 would starve. And John's birthday coincided with the Lammas Fair in Ballycastle, so he thought he would come over to the mainland for a bit of crack. So he spruced himself up and he sailed over on the morning tide. And when he got into the town, it was heaving with people. There were card trick men and fortune tellers and hawkers and fiddlers and pipers at every pub door. The people were singing and dancing and telling stories. And John wasn't there 5 minutes till he spied the most beautiful wee lassie he'd ever seen in his life. She had long black hair tied back in a ponytail. And whatever way the August sun caught it, it just shone like a rook's wing. Well, John was entranced by her, and he followed her. And when she moved on, he moved on. And when she stopped, he stopped. And then he heard a voice call, Nancy, Nancy. And he looked across, and there was an older man John took to be a relative. And Nancy ran barefoot across the road to the older man. Well, eventually John got close enough and brave enough to speak to the young girl. Are ye selling horses today, miss? Yes, she said, my grandfather is. If we get a good price, he says we might stay for a day. And then the old man turned and looked at John. John took off his hat. How you doing, sir? Would you be needing any help with your horses tomorrow? Well, the old fella took a good look at John and he said, we're camped out along the commons. Why don't you come out with us and have a bite of supper? Well, of course, Nancy and her grandfather were travelling people, and John knew that straight away. And as a guest of the travellers, he could be sure that he was going to be treated like a king. They dined on the best of rabbit stew, and the meat just melted in John's mouth. The old fella was watching him, and he said, "It's the open air, son. Food tastes better, drinks better, even the air itself is better." And then the old fella produced a crystal clear bottle of poteen. Do you know what that is? I do, sir. Would you like a wee drop? And him and John fell till the bottle of poteen. And then the old fella produced a fiddle, and he played a few tunes, and John listened with his eyes closed. And then the old fella said, "Give us a song or a story there, young fella." And John started to sing. "My young love said to me, my mother won't mind, and my father won't slight you, for your lack of kind." And she went her way homewards with one star awake, as the swan in the evening moves over the lake. And John could sing, but so could Nancy. She could sing like a blackbird. And when she joined in on the song, well, it was just lovely. And whether it was the poteen or the beautiful harmonies or what, but two big salty tears just rolled down the old fella's ruddy cheeks. Well, they arose the next morning at the Craigagh dawn, and they combed out the horses' manes and their tails, and they took grease from the skillet and soot from the fire, and they blackened the horses' hoofs. And they tidied the campsite up in themselves, and they led the horses into town. Well, John led the horses up and down the street 2 or 3 times each, and there was a lot of spitting and clapping of hands, but eventually all the dealing was done, and the new owners led their horses away. And after they'd had their fill of the fair, they went back to their campsite outside the town. And the old fellow was tired, and he went on into his caravan, and he said to Nancy, "Morning comes quickly. Don't be sitting up too late now, Nancy." And of course, when the 2 young ones were left on their own, a wee spark must have jumped out of that fire and into their hearts, for they lay together under that beautiful Lammas sky. They woke them next morning, and nothing to hide their modesty but an old horse blanket. And the fire was out, and the pots and pans were gone, and the caravan was gone, and Nancy's grandfather was gone. Well, they jumped up and pulled on their clothes in a hurry. And when John pulled on his waistcoat, he put his hand in his pocket, he felt a weight, and he took out a little bag, and in it was 24 gold sovereign coins. "What's this?" he said to Nancy. "Where did they come from?" But Nancy was by herself with shame and guilt. Eventually she said, "It's my dowry. My grandfather has left it for you." "What?" John tried to give her the money, but she wouldn't take it. They searched high up and low down, but they could find no trace of Nancy's grandfather. He was gone. And there was nothing else for it but John to take Nancy back over the Sound to Rathlin. He knew the folk would be talking. He knew his mother would be pulling her hair out in handfuls, but a team of wild horses wouldn't have dragged him away from Nancy. Now he was head over heels, and it was obvious that she felt the same way about him. He didn't think it was possible to be happier. And that was until May Eve the following year, when Nancy gave birth to a wee baby daughter. She was the most beautiful wean you had ever seen. And she had a great shock of black hair. And she was the spit of her mother. There was nothing else to call her but Nancy. And they would have lived happily ever after. But there was one fly in the ointment. As Nancy had drawn closer to her time, John had noticed that she became very distant and very weepy. The old men said in the fields when John was working, it's the same way, all women are the same. They always get thrown when they're coming near the time. Sure, it's the same way, a cow and calf. And for a while that contented John, but after she had the child, she got worse. And then she started to wake up at night, and John would notice the bed empty and the clothes pulled back. And he would go out to look for her, and he would find her out across the beach. He thought she was sleepwalking, and he didn't want to wake her, for he heard that it was dangerous to do so. And then eventually he spoke to his mother about it. John, son, do you not know what's happening? Nancy's a traveller. She's never stayed in the same place 2 nights in a row in her life. Island life is no life for a girl like Nancy, son. What'll I do, mother? He said. Oh, dear son. Do you remember, you were only a wee boy, but do you remember when your father used to catch the wee linnets, the winnie greys he called them, out on the gorse bushes? And he would bring them into the house, and they sung beautiful all spring and summer, and then they stopped singing. And they stopped eating, and their feathers dropped. And your father knew that if he didn't let them go, they would only die. And that was all she said. Well, Lammas time came round again, and John said to Nancy, the fair's on again next week in Ballycastle, Nancy. Do you want to go over a wee scoot, and we'll take the wean with us, and sure, maybe your grandfather will be up again. Nancy bounced out of the chair, and she threw her arms around John, and she kissed him. The life seemed to come back into her. And then on the morning of the fair, John got them ready and got the boat loaded and brought them over to Ballycastle. He tied the boat up at the quay, and then he made up some excuse, some chore he'd forgot to do. And he told Nancy, I have to go back over to the island, but take this. And he took out the wee bag of gold coins, and he gave it to Nancy. He said, if you see anything you fancy for you or the wean, just treat yourselves. I'll be back over this evening, and sure, we'll maybe stay for a day or two. And that was the last time either of them clapped eyes on one another. And John moped around the island for a couple of years after that, and eventually when his mother passed away, he could stick it no longer, and he sold the place up for a pittance to a neighbour. And he came over here to Murloch Bay, just behind me, a wee cottage, and he lived like a hermit there. But every Lammas time, he would make the long trek across the boulder field, up the Grey Man's Path, over Fairhead and down into the town. And 17 years passed, and Lammas time came round again. And he opened his front door this morning, and there was a big sea mist rolling in. And he, it'll maybe be faired by the morrow, and he closed his door. And right enough, the next morning it had cleared, and John made the trek across the boulder field, up the Grey Man's Path, and when he got to the top of the path, he stopped to catch his breath. And as he looked over Loch na Cranach, he could see a single swan just glide across the water. And then something caught out the side of his other eye, and he looked over to the edge, and it was a shawl. He went closer and got down on his hands and knees, and he looked down the sheer basalt cliff. And 400 feet below him was a sprawled body. He made his way down, and when he got there, he turned it over, and broken and bruised as it was, he recognised her immediately. For she was the spitting image of her mother. It was his daughter, Nancy. Well, he took her over to Rathlin Island and he buried her in with his mother. You see, it transpired she had been in the town the day before and she'd searched everywhere, inquired after John McIntyre, her father. And eventually a publican told her where she would find her father, but he warned her, do not go over Fairhead tonight, you'll be lost, dear, it's far too dangerous. Stay in the town and maybe your father will come in tomorrow. Of course, she was so impatient to meet her father for the first time. She never listened to the advice and she paid for her impetuousness with her young life. Shortly after that, her father followed her into the grave, died of a broken heart, they say. And many years later, an English tourist on a walking tour of Ireland was benighted up here on Fairhead. And very wisely he chose to camp beside Loch na Cranach. And when he came down into Ballycastle the next day, he told everyone that the whole night long he could hear the most beautiful song being sung by a young girl. Of course, the locals all knew about the young girl who sings up on Fairhead when the sea mist is in. And so, if you ever find yourself up here and you hear that singing, don't be afraid. For it's only young Nancy McIntyre singing for her father. She went away from me and she moved through the fair, and fondly I watched her move here and move there. And she went her way homewards with her goods and her gear. And that was the last that I saw of my dear.